We're going to start off with the Lions. The Lions combined for a franchise best 15-2 regular season record. They had the NFL's highest point differential at 222. This was a damn good team, widely considered the favorite in the NFC at one point, right? And it didn't end up that way. 5 turnovers and an injury-ravaged defense really led to a 45-31 loss to the Commanders in the playoffs, right? On their quest to their first ever Super Bowl. While the ending was painful, that really shouldn't distract us from the fact that last year's Lions were, a force to be reckoned with. Okay. Detroit Lions last year were first in points per game at 33. EPA per drop back, third, EPA per rush in the run game, and they were ranked 5th. And then their defense was 7th against points against. So all around, it's really a solid team. They had a great year again. It kind of came down to injuries and just running out of gas. So, however, unfortunate top of the food chain problems are now impacting Detroit, right? Coordinators Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn take their talents to Chicago and to New York. Good news, the bulk of the roster key contributors remained intact, right? And just a bit better luck from the injury gods, could make this season's edition of the Lions better than ever, right? If we sprinkle a little fairy dust and hope for the best of health. But again, today we're going to basically go over how we view these positions for the Detroit Lions. So how much upside does Jared Goff really have in fantasy football land? Okay. Goff is fresh off his best regular season ever, based on pretty much any efficiency stats you look at. Okay. The version was even better than the guy that we saw put up all kinds of numbers alongside Sean McVay back when he was with the Rams. Okay. 4,629 yards and 37 touchdowns, 38 if you include his touchdown catch. We're good enough for a quarterback 7 in fantasy points per game. Here's the only problem with assuming a high-end encore in 2025. Okay, this Lions offense, like Goff, has been awesome the last 3 years. But pocket passers who run as little as the 30-year-old franchise quarterback need to be almost perfect through the air in order to contend with the dual threat quarterbacks in the position that, in the top 5. Okay. Consider that just 2% of Goff's fantasy points came from rushing production last year. Okay? He's not a runner, guys. The only other quarterbacks under 5% would be Tua, Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins, which was 0%. That's kind of crazy. I wrote that down. And then Joe Flacco, 2%. Okay. Bottom line is, it's not like many expect Goff to be drastically, fall off or anything. That's not what I'm getting at tonight. It's just that Goff's quarterback 13 price tag, okay, in early fantasy drafts is a steep price to pay when similar status-esque archetypes, with at least some proven high-end fantasy production, say CJ Stroud, Tua, Stafford. I think they're available even in multiple rounds later on average. So, this isn't somebody that I'm chasing. Okay. Does Jahmyr Gibbs deserve to be the running back 1 in fantasy? Well, Gibbs' combination of dominance as a rusher and receiver is, largely unmatched at the position. We can be honest about that. The rising third-year talent ceiling is admittedly a bit capped, okay, as David Montgomery is healthy, right, because they do have that dual-back system. But even then, the efficiency and the big play ability are too great to really care all that much, okay? Overall, Gibbs worked as the running back 5 in PPR points per game at 18.7 in weeks 1 through 15 with a healthy David Montgomery. Okay, the running back 1 in weeks 16 to 18 when Montgomery was out. Okay, he was the undisputed lead back. He had averaged 32 fantasy points per game those 3 weeks. I remember when people back in August were really worried about his hamstring injury and how lingering it was going to be, and that didn't really pan out either. So, and what about Monty? The man's been a model of consistency, right? When it comes to beating his affordable ADP ever since joining the Lions back in 2023, I believe. In 2023, he was running back 15 in points per game, and he was a running back 31 in the preseason. Okay, so he almost doubled his ADP. Last season, he was running back 16 in points per game with a preseason ADP of 21. So, 5 spots better, but it's like I say it all the time. If they beat their ADP, it's a valuable pick for you. It's what it boils down to. Okay. Even the pass game usage is a bit underrated. Did you know that Montgomery, who caught 36 passes last year, scored more points per game as a receiver, okay, than Saquon, Josh Jacobs, James Cook, and Bucky Irvin barely out-edged him. Okay, this is the company he is, and when it comes to the receiving game. So Montgomery's not a slouch either. He's just not getting the volume that Gibbs is getting. Okay, so the bottom line is the only thing preventing Gibbs from being the running back 1 fantasy is the reality that fellow, flat out ultra talented, but Saquon and Bijan, don't have that Sonic and Knuckles, right? They don't have that 2-back system to really fight with. They don't have that to deal with. So I think that is what is preventing him more so. You can add Derrick Henry into that conversation. But Jahmyr Gibbs has that David Montgomery fighting into his carries, and I think that is what is preventing him from coming over that hump and being that running back 1 in all fantasy. Gibbs is my 6th ranked overall player and is someone I'm comfortable taking ahead of wide receivers not named Chase, Jefferson, and Lamb. Let's be honest about it. Okay. As for Monty, he continues to look like a rock-solid value at his low-end running back 2, right, price tag. Although it's tough to outrank him ahead of guys like Alvin Kamara, Chuba Hubbard, James Conner, right? We've talked about James Conner and his workload. It comes down to the workload. If you give them more opportunities, they have more opportunities to produce points, okay? Don't underrate Montgomery's own potential for fireworks, should Gibbs, that hamstring injury come back or anything like that. He racked up 59 combined carries and targets for 4 touchdowns in only 2 games without Gibbs in 2023. So, those weeks were running back 2 and running back 5 finishes. So, even if Gibbs were to go down, Montgomery's a great handcuff to have, sitting on the bench. So how often does one team produce multiple top 24 fantasy wide receivers? Okay. Sun God averaged more EPA per target and posted the position's highest catch rate over expected among all wide receivers with at least 65 targets last season. Okay, that's according to Next Gen Stats. The wide receiver 10, wide receiver 4, and wide receiver 4 finishes in points per game over the last 3 seasons. Okay, you know St. Brown is locked in, is really a top 8 in wide receiver in fantasy. I know St. Brown is locked in top 8 wide receiver in fantasy. We all know, right? St. Brown, again, I will say it, is a locked top 8 in fantasy. I can't reiterate it enough. The better question is just what we can expect from Jameson Williams following his breakout 2024 campaign. Little over 1,000 yards in total yards, 8 scores in just 15 games, led to 14.2 points per contest. That was good for a wide receiver 24 status. Okay, so that's where we get into how often does this happen? 2 wide receivers in the top 24. Okay, the fact that Williams accomplished all of this on just 91 targets is, well, it's pretty impressive. Only A.J. Brown, Mike Williams, and George Kittle have managed to crack the century mark with fewer pass game opportunities since targets have been tracked in 1992. So, again, great company. That was Mike Williams back when he was in his prime in a Charger uniform. The team's relative lack of additional target competition at wide receivers should continue to result in St. Brown and Williams receiving the lion's share of the work. No pun intended. This brings us to the key question: just how often does this multiple top 24 wide receivers in the same season? More than you think. Actually, the answer is, and specifically an average of 5 teams per season have enabled multiple top 24 wide receivers in PPR points per game over the last decade of action. Okay, shout out 2018 Rams and the 2020 Buccaneers as the only teams with 3. Okay. Which would be like, you see Godwin and Evans. The Rams was, if I remember correctly, Cup was a big increment of that. But I think that was when Nakua was coming on the scene. Maybe a little after that. But listen, the bottom line, St. Brown continues to have one of the highest floors at the position thanks to his chemistry with Goff and an elite scoring offense, more than willing to flow its passing game through him, right? We've seen that with double-digit targets several times throughout the season. Barring a complete collapse without the help of Ben Johnson, he should once again return top 10 production at the position. It's hard to argue with a profile like that in round 1 in drafts of most shapes and sizes, okay? As for Williams, his early wide receiver 27 price tag seems about right for his boomer bust wide receiver 3 profile. If things go as swimmingly as 2024 did, another borderline wide receiver 2 finish is okay to be on the table. Just realize expecting too big of a boom for the hopeful number 2 target in this run-first offense might be wishful thinking, okay? I'm more of a fan of a clear-cut number 1 wide receivers like Cortland Sutton, DK Metcalf, Zay Flowers, Calvin Ridley, who are at similar cost with Jameson Williams, okay? Don't expect any other Detroit wide receivers to really garner any fantasy relevance without an injury or suspension next year. With that said, shout out Tim Patrick holding down the number 3 job last year after back-to-back brutal summer season. Just in training camp, blows out his knee twice. So, it was great to see Tim Patrick producing on the football field. So, shout out to him. So next is Sam Laporta a good bet for a post-hype bounce back? Okay. Last year was a disappointment for Laporta. Mostly just relative to his preseason fantasy hype. Okay, he was the second, typically was the first tight end off the board in drafts last year, and averaging. After taking over Travis Kelce's number 1 spot last year, he took it as a rookie. So, he was the guy to draft last year. He was the number one tight end to take it off. So, unfortunately, Laporta failed to reciprocate that magic, for the vast majority of last season. Strong end to the year kind of helped him post a respectable tight end 9 finish in points per game. It's likely that many of the fantasy managers who drafted the Iowa product, in the first place, were no longer in a position to overly benefit from the performance. Okay. Laporta's points per game last year, weeks 1 through 7, he was tight end 22. Weeks 8 through 14 was a tight end 11, was a lot better. But the weeks 15 to the playoffs, he was 16 points per game at tight end 2. So he really turned it on last year at the end. Early season hamstring and ankle injuries didn't help matters. Laporta ultimately wound up averaging just 5.2 targets per game after going for 7.1 as a rookie. So that was a big deal. Also getting 2 less targets per game at the year after. However, it might behoove fantasy managers, right? Dynasty faithfuls in particular, to not freak out too much. Okay. Like, I don't think you should be shipping him off for the highest price. We're still talking about the 6th best tight end ever in points per game during their first 2 seasons. Okay. The guy's having a heck of a start of the year. He just had a bad start last year. But the bottom line is Laporta is all for, he's my consensus ranked tight end number 4. Okay. Although the big 3 options at the positions are all going inside what I would say maybe possibly a top 40, top 45. Laporta is going as the 58th, according to Fantasy Life, overall player off the board. This disparity reflects the drop-off. I would not take him above guys, obviously, like Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle. But after that, he definitely draws my interest above everyone else at the position, okay? Nobody needs more than one hand to really count the number of tight ends that you'd rather have in fantasy land this year, right? But the 3, the cost between Laporta and the guys higher, like Evan Ingram and David Njoku, has usually resulted in me passing on Laporta and going more towards an Evan Ingram or David Njoku. David Njoku. They're going to require the same target volume. I think David has a great year, and then Evan Ingram, I think, is going to be a target machine for Bo Nix in Denver, and we've talked about both of those guys. So what has been the best offensive line in football over the last few years? It's a lot of people say Philly, a lot of people say the Lions. In pass blocking, the Lions have a great argument. Okay, we'll start there. In pass blocking, the Lions have allowed the 9th longest average time to pressure. Okay, 2.56 seconds. And the 10th lowest pressure rate overall, which is 32%. This is in the last 3 seasons. In run blocking, the Lions running backs have averaged 1.7 yards before contact per carry in that span. Okay, this is impressive considering the result of the usual top teams on this list. Again, Eagles, Ravens, Bills benefit from the gravity of their respective dual threat quarterbacks, right? Something Mr. Goff obviously does not offer. Overall, we looked this up on PFF, have consistently provided, favorable reports on the Lions' end of season ranking, right? 2022, they were 8th. 2023, they jumped up to 2nd. And 2024, they were 4th. Don't expect too much really to change from a group with 4 of the 5 starters. So I expect them to, be a top 5 O-line again. So what is the prediction for the Detroit Lions for 2025? It's curious that the Lions' 10.5 win total places them a tier below, teams like the Bills, Eagles, Chiefs, and Ravens. They're the only teams sitting at 11.5. So while the first place schedule isn't obviously going to be ideal for them, more success on offense and just a bit better maybe injury luck on defense should lead to, more high-end results. Okay, so give me the over on 10.5. I can go 11 or 12 wins for Detroit this year. But my bold fantasy prediction is that both Gibbs and Montgomery this year managed to turn in top 12 seasons in half PPR leagues points per game.